will start in 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Ten seconds. All right, let's pray. Lord, we do thank you so much for this time. We thank you for the gift of the gospel. We thank you for our church and the stream of faithful witnesses who have gone before us. And as we continue to consider church history, we do pray that this would not just be an intellectual exercise, but you would use this in ways that we don't even know to ask, that you would use this to strengthen our church and our witness, that we would be more faithful as Grace Covenant Baptist Church to serve you as long as you would leave us on this earth. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're continuing our really quick trek through church history. If you're just joining us or if you haven't been with us in a while, we spent a little time in the Reformation, and last week was our first last 2 weeks were our first post-Reformation classes. So we started looking at what were the theological developments and discussions that were happening after. So we looked at what was going on in Luther's in the German world, and Lutheranism, in the Reform world, over in France and Switzerland. Last week we considered Roman Catholicism and the whole Jansenist controversy and all those Roman Catholic Calvinists that we didn't know existed. And this week we're going to talk about the Puritans. How many people here have owned a Puritan paperback? How many people here have ever, and maybe not, you don't have that particular print. How many people have read a book by a Puritan or about a Puritan? Okay, good. They're very popular for good reason. Also very maligned in certain circles, but very popular and for good reason. So now, who can tell me what a Puritan is? That does tend to become stickier, doesn't it? Well, what about, give me some examples. Who can name a Puritan? If you can't tell me what a Puritan is, who can name a Puritan? Thomas Watson. No one else. Brooks. There you go. They all have, a lot of them have the same first name: Richard Baxter, Richard Sibbs, Richard Hooke. I mean, so if you say an old English name, you're gonna hit one of them. Any others? Any favorites? Flavel? Yeah. So what do these guys have in common? What do we think? Who are the Puritans? We like them. Who are they? Well, how is that word used today? Like in common conversation, in like modern American English vernacular. How do we use the word Puritan? Yeah, it's like a bad thing. Don't just puritanical. You're too serious. You're too legalistic. But I'm interested in the genesis of this term and the historical context of these people that we read with such benefit. Who were they? What were they? What defined a Puritan? Was it Calvinism? Well, then there would be lots of people who we would call Puritan that we generally don't lump into Puritans, and there were actually Puritans who were not Calvinists. The majority were Reformed, but not all of them. And if we define it as someone who's just very serious about their faith, well then, all real Christians throughout time be called Puritans, but that's generally not how we use the word. Yes, as many terms, names were, it was originally derogatory. They actually used it, there was Puritan, and then there was, I'm going to say it wrong, Prescient, from precise, like you're being very precise, too precise. Jose. Yeah, so we're going to get into and talk about who the Puritans were. We're not going to talk about specific Puritans, a little bit of a broad overview this week. Maybe we'll get into some of my favorite names next week. Your Owens, your Baxters and Sibbs. But we're going to talk about their context today and what was happening, a broad overview of the theological controversies, and as always, deeply entwined with political controversies. We're going to do the same thing we did last week, which is we're jumping a little bit back in time to the middle of the 1500s, back to Reformation time, just to set the period and then lead us up into the 1600s, where this label really starts to become one used, but also historically relevant. So we're over in England. We're in Anglicanism. The English church, we'll say. I don't know when the term Anglicanism actually came about, but we're dealing with the English church. Now, who can remind me, so if we're talking about the four major branches, ideological, theological branches of the Reformation time, Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Reformed, Anabaptists, Radical Reformation, which as we saw is quite varied, more so than any of the others. But if we're dealing with those kind of four major theological branches, where did the English church fall? Does anyone remember? We mentioned, we didn't talk a lot about them, but where were they? What camp was the English church in? During the Reformation time, as it kind of settled. Samuel. Well, yeah. So so you had a basically reformed theology. Many of the initial reformers in England were coming out of Geneva, were coming out of Calvin's, the Swiss reformed world. And so you had a basically reformed theology overall, but then you had a Lutheran view of church and state, which, does anyone remember what's the Lutheran view of church and state? This is how it settled, sort of. What was the Lutheran view of church and state? The state oversees the official church. So you had the idea that the church is an invisible body of all true believers. So that's what the church is, in distinction from Roman Catholicism, which said, no, the church is the institution. So all of the Protestants agreed, no, the church is the invisible body of all true believers. But of course, there is still an outward organization. There is still an outward institution. Who runs that? The Lutheran view was the state runs it. And the state should run it. And that's where we kind of eventually end up in the English church. You got an overall Reformed view of theology, but you had a Lutheran view of church and state, where the state is running the church. How we got there is full of twists and turns. You guys will remember Henry VIII, we've heard of Henry VIII, and he leaves Roman Catholicism because he wants to divorce his wife. And so that's our first initial sort of official split. But then his son, Edward VI, by all accounts, seemed to be a devout Reformed believer. And so he's the one who kind of shapes particularly the English National Church into being a more Reformed theological entity as we would recognize it today. Then Edward dies, and his sister Mary takes over. Why do we know Mary? Who do we know Mary at? Like, what's her nickname? Bloody Mary. Why do we call her Bloody Mary? Yeah, she wanted to reverse all that. She was a convictional Catholic. She wanted to go back, and so she engaged in bloody persecution of the Protestants, tried to reverse all the reforms. That was a rough time period. Then after Bloody Mary, Elizabeth. Elizabeth comes into power in the 1558, and she settles things down. She's Protestant, and we get what they call a settlement of 1559, where she said, okay, I want to end all this religious war. I want to end the back and forth. Let's make some decisions. Let's make some decisions about what the English church is going to be. It's going to be Protestant. Basically Reformed in its theology. As Samuel mentioned, there was more in the Elizabethan settlement of 1559. There was more ceremony that we would have associated or that arose from the medieval time period. So more medieval ceremony than you would have found, say, in the Reformed world in Geneva. And Elizabeth wanted to standardize. So like all the churches, we were on the same page theology, we're on the same page practice-wise. And up until this point, I mean, obviously you had the persecutions of Mary, but you had quite a variety of convictions and practices. You might go to one English church where the pastor was wearing vestments, the white flowery gown, I don't remember what they call it, and you'd go to others where the pastor was dressed just the same as anyone else. So you had a little more variety. I think London at the time, you had lots of options, but the Elizabethan settlement wanted to standardize that. And now you also had, coupled with that, people returning who had fled Mary. You had a lot of people running away from Mary, a lot of pastors, theologians leaving, and they're going to places like Geneva. They're going to the Reformed center of the world. And they're being exposed to Genevan worship. They're being exposed to Swiss Reformed worship, which was more bare bones as far as ceremony was concerned, as far as outward trappings. And so then they come back, and a lot of Elizabeth's decisions did not work for them. They said, nope, that's too much like Catholicism. That's a going backwards. The vestments, the kneeling. So other issues would have included coming up and kneeling to receive communion, which was part of the Elizabethan settlement. So that's how you do communion. You'd have a communion table, and it'd be kind of roped off. And then I've actually been in an Anglican church, and I've taken communion this way. And then when it's time for communion, everyone comes up individually. They kneel and they receive communion from the pastor, the priest. And so you had vestments, you had things like that, sign of the cross, certain Baptistic formulas, things that, especially the Reformed coming back, who had been exposed to Calvin and Zwingli's world and had a particular view of what the regular principle of worship meant, said, no, these are not okay. These things that we have settled on here in England are not okay. And so you had dissenters. You had people who said, no, we don't want to do this. And it's from this world that we get our first Puritans. So we actually kind of had two groups that resulted from this. You had the Puritans and you had the Separatists. The Separatists were the ones who said, we want out. We want out of the English church. We want out of Anglicanism. It's too corrupt, and we're leaving. And you had various people and groups do that over this time period for various reasons. The Puritans, at least at this time period, before and during the English Civil War, which we'll talk about, the Puritans were those who stayed, who were in Anglicanism, who were in the English church, but who wanted it reformed. So the Puritans, they want the English church reformed. They want it further reformed. The reforms haven't gone far enough, and where we've settled with the Elizabethan settlement is not good. And you had various streams of how they handled that. So you had the very mild, we'll call them the mild Puritans. They were the ones who said, we don't like a lot of these things, but we're not going to do anything. Like if you'd asked them, they would have said, I don't like vestments. I don't like kneeling to receive communion, but I don't think we need to work to change this. Let's just keep preaching and teaching the word. Let's just be rigorous, gospel-centered people, and we'll let things shake out the way they will. And then you had the ones who were, what shall we call them? We'll just say the active reformers. And they, in an agreement with the more mild Puritans, they said, okay, we think these things are bad, but we're not going to, I guess this is a misleading active reform, we're not going to campaign. We're not going to campaign Parliament. We're not going to go through official measures to change this. We're not going to try to force a change. But we are going to seek a change. The mild Puritans, we aren't even necessarily seeking a change. The active reformers, they were seeking a change, but the means that they were doing that by is still by preaching and teaching. So let's preach and teach. Let's get a grassroots movement. Let's convince the people. Let's convince the people by preaching and teaching. We'll get a swell, and that will eventually work itself out in reforms in Parliament and the monarchy, so on and so forth. Then you had, we'll call the militant Presbyterians. Also fairly common among all the Puritans, particularly at this time, was among the reforms they wanted was a Presbyterian-style government. Presbyterian-style government as opposed to the Episcopalian system that was existing in the English church at the time. Who can tell me the difference between the Episcopalian system and the Presbyterian system of government? Julian. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So in Episcopalianism, you're generally, you've got one person, and at your various levels, it's one person who's in charge. So you got your one person who's in charge of your church, and then your groups of churches in your area will be overseen by one person, so on and so forth. I forget the names for all the different titles. The bishop oversees kind of like the largest area, and so you've got your one person in the Episcopalian system. In the Presbyterian system, you've got elders, you've got councils, you've got what they call presbytery. And so you have this at the local church level. It's called the session. So in our church, our session currently is Julian, me, and Paul in Presbyterian language. I speak Presbyterian. I went to Westminster Theological Seminary, so I know how they talk. So we would be called the session. And then you have presbytery. Well, you have your, depending on how big your denomination is, you would have different levels. But so your churches would be grouped into areas. And so all of your churches would not be independent, all part of a denomination. And at presbytery, you'd send a couple representatives from your session to presbytery. And so presbytery, say there were 6 churches in whatever presbytery, maybe they each send 2 elders. And so you got another body of elders. So these 12 people who are now over all of these churches, and so on and so forth, all the way up to, when necessary, General Assembly. When all the churches have representatives and this body has authority over all of the member churches. So you had Presbyterianism as the dominant form of church government over in the Swiss Reform world, and it was, by and large, what the Puritans wanted. So you had the milder ones, you had the ones who were like, okay, we want to see reform, but we're still going to do it by preaching primarily. Then you had the militant Presbyterians who were like, nope, we're going to make this Presbyterian. We're going to make the English church Presbyterian. We're going to petition the Parliament. We're going to hand out pamphlets. We're going to raise a fuss. We're going to make this a Presbyterian church. But they were all still staying. They were all still within the English church at this time. You had, and Elizabeth didn't like the Puritans. She thought they were anarchists and they were disrespecting her rule, and so she tried to stamp them out. She battled them all the time. All of the Puritans tended to have a very high view of education. We want, particularly among the leadership, we want to have educated pastors. We want to have pastors who know the Bible, who know Greek and Hebrew. And so education was big for all the Puritans. And one of the things they did, which they picked up from Zwingli, was called conferences. And I had never heard of these, and they sound so cool. I was like, that sounds awesome. And so this was a method of education in the university, but it spilled out into just sort of being a popular public thing. So this is what a conference was. You'd get 4 or 5 guys together, and each of them would either have a specialty or be assigned a specialty. Like, you're our expert in Hebrew, you're our expert in Greek, you're our philosopher, you're our church historian, you're our systematic theologian, and you'd get them together, and they would have a topic that they would discuss, and they would just do. And the idea was, we got our varying expertises, and this will help sharpen us, and we'll all discuss a topic or a text or something, and they're all working together and meditating on and growing in their knowledge. And so that was a method in the universities, particularly, that had come over. So you had that happening at Cambridge, I think Oxford too. But then that kind of spilled out. That became like popular. People would people would come and watch. Like, he would just come and sit and watch these people talk amongst themselves. It became something for popular consumption. They became very popular. They were known as prophesyings, but that word does not mean what you think. I've just described exactly what it was. Conferences, prophesyings. Elizabeth did not like them. She thought they were anarchists. And sure enough, like, yeah, there would be criticisms of the church as it existed at the time, happening at these conferences, so on and so forth. So she tried to just stamp them out. She had her Bishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. She told him, you got to enforce all of the settlement rules on all of the churches. You got to make them all wear vestments. You got to make them do communion this way. Said there was a variety. You got to make them. And so you had your Puritan ministers who fought back. A couple of these guys, some of the leading leaders of the Puritans in the early stages, Samson and Humphrey, right? Nope, they were guys who came out of the Reformed world. They had been exiles under Mary. They came out and they're like, nope, we're not putting on vestments. We're not doing this. You remember this vestments was a big deal in Lutheranism in the post-Reform world too. So we're not doing that. It's bad, and it's too much of a confusion with Roman Catholic. It's going backwards. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, who was they're all basically Reformed guys, who had sympathies. He had sympathies with the Puritans, but he was willing to submit. He didn't buy the argument. He said, listen, Samson, Humphrey, no one is going to confuse you with Roman Catholics if you're wearing the white thing. I forget its name. Does anyone know what they still wear today? What's the Anglican white robe that they wear? No one's going to confuse you with Roman Catholics if you're wearing that kind of white priestly robe thing. Because the second they hear you preach, they will understand you're not a Roman Catholic. And we can understand this argument. Like, people say, like, it doesn't matter how Pastor Paul dresses. We can put Pastor Paul in a white gown, and the second you hear him talk, you're like, well, you're not a Roman Catholic. Parker's like, no one's going to confuse you guys with Roman Catholic. Your preaching is very solidly Protestant, Reformed, but they weren't buying it. Samson and Humphrey says, no, it's too much of a concession, and we don't like the ceremony. And so they thought to their head, like, we're going to appeal over your head. Not literally in the official structures of the church. There is no one higher than the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Queen. I mean, the Queen was, in the settlement that the Queen became, or the monarch, that at this time happens to be Elizabeth, becomes I forget the full title. It's like the Supreme Lord and Governor of the church. That's still their title to this day, the monarch. It's like they are the head of the church. And so in the church structure, there is nothing higher than the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Queen. But in the wider theological world, there's the Reformed in Switzerland that we all look up to. And so Calvin is dead at this point. Peter Martyr is dead at this point, relatively recently. But Bullinger is still alive, and he's the elder Reformed statesman. He's our mind. And so Samson and Humphrey, they write to Bullinger, and they explain everything. And now if Bullinger has sided with them, that would, even though like he's got no official position in the English church, that would have carried a lot of weight. Bullinger sided with Matthew Parker and the Queen. Not on the issue, but he said, these are indifferent things, and this is not worth fighting over. It might be less than ideal, but your people will be better served by you wearing a vestment and preaching the gospel than by refusing to preach the gospel because you have to wear a vestment. And so we can appreciate that logic as well. Bullinger said, submit. This is not worth fighting over. This is not an issue that should cause you to leave your churches and leave your people. And so, well, that was not what Samson and Humphrey wanted to hear. And on this conflict went. You occasionally had people all out leaving the English church, but by and large, they were seeking to reform it. You had a whole movement in the latter part of the 1500s. You had a whole, maybe into the 1600s, you had a whole secret Presbyterian movement. A fellow named John Fields, he like, well, okay, we're all still Anglicans, we're all still part of the English church, it's still an Episcopal system, but we're just going to run our churches as if they were Presbyterian. And so they did. And then they, with other like-minded churches in the area, they started having their pastors meet together in Presbyterian. And so secret Presbyterianism spread throughout the Anglican Church. It got pretty far before it was stamped out. So you had just a huge chunk of the church, even though it's by law and constitution is Anglican. Like, we're operating as a Presbyterian church anyway. So you had that. Eventually, Elizabeth dies, and she's replaced with James I, who we know better as King James of King James Bible fame. And by all accounts, he was a fairly convictional, reform guy. He was more open to reform and the idea that the church could use further reform than Elizabeth had been. And so right away, King James takes the throne, and the Puritans, they all, I mean, not literally all, but they get together and they write to the king. He's newly king. He just becomes king. They write to him. It's like, listen, we need to reform the church. This is the harsh way to say, here's our list of demands, but not list of demands. Here's what we want. Here's what we could do. And James calls a religious conference. He calls a council. And the non-Puritans on the other side, they weren't happy about that. But he calls this conference. You had very strong people on the other side who were saying, no, we think this is Anglicanism as it is right. Some of the things that the Puritans are making a fuss over are they're either wrong about, or they're making too big a deal about it. And Archbishop of Canterbury at this point, name of Whitgift, he was a very strong Calvinist, but a very anti-Puritan thinker. And so you had a conservative, we'll call it, movement within Anglicanism that wanted to stay Anglican as it was, and thought the Puritans were pushing things too far. They were unhappy about this conference that King James called. But King James calls a conference, and there were some agreement on some reforms. There were agreement on some reforms that they would take for the English church. None of them got enacted because a month after the conference ended and they all agreed, like, okay, this is what we'll do to reform the church. A month after the conference ended, that fellow I just mentioned, Whitgift, he died. I mean, he was anti-Puritan, but he still, we agreed on these reforms, we're going to enact them. He died, and he was replaced by someone who is vehemently anti-Puritan, by the name of Bancroft, vehemently anti-Puritan Anglican who did not want any reforms, and so he just ignored their decisions. And King James, more passive, and he had other things to worry about, and he didn't maybe super care about this discussion. I mean, he was willing to call the conference, but he didn't care as much. So he never went to any effort to make sure that what was officially decided upon was actually enforced and actually happened. So none of the reforms actually happened. They agreed upon them, and then, as many of you in institutions and organizations may have had experience with something like this before, where we have discussed this, we have made a decision, and then we never act on it. So that's what happened. Yeah. But King James did have his translation of the Bible. Depending on who you talk to, it was either other people's idea or it was his idea himself to get a new English vernacular. And so the King James Bible was produced, and the number of scholars working on it, that's over 60, came from all sorts of different camps within the English-speaking world. So it was not a theological monolith of people who produced the King James Bible, but a good, it seems like James was mostly just concerned with their scholarship, their mental abilities. And so you had the King James Bible produced. I mean, technically, it's still 80% Tyndale's Bible. Like in King James, like you ask King James, my new translation, but it's still it's 80% Tyndale. So Tyndale should get a lot of credit for that as well. During this time, you also have the arising of the First Baptists. Yay. You had people breaking off. You had separatists going their own ways, some leaving England altogether, some staying. Actually, technically, the First Baptists out of the English church, they left. I'm forgetting where they went. They left, maybe over to Holland, the Dutch world. They encounter some Mennonites. And so the very, very first Baptists in 1603, 1607, 1609, they were influenced more by the Anabaptist world, actually completely left Reformed theology, became Pelagian in the Mennonite sense. But then you also had strong Reformed English Christians who decided to leave Anglicanism, who became what we know as the Particular Baptists, the Reformed Baptists. And so by the middle of the 1600s, even earlier, 1630, you started to have Reformed Baptist congregations in London, in England. So you've got separatists breaking off at the time, but still, at this time period, the Puritans are the ones we think of who actually stayed and were pushing for reform. And then comes to the throne Charles I. King Charles I was, well, he wasn't that great a king, I guess. I mean, depending on how you evaluate kings. King Charles, so King James had a very strong belief in the divine right of rule. The king is accountable only to God, not to his subjects. King James had a very strong belief in that, theologically. But he practically recognized, like, I got to still work with Parliament and stuff. Even though I shouldn't have to, like theologically I shouldn't have to, practically I kind of got to. And so King James recognized the practical value of the king working with Parliament. His son, Charles I, very much believed in the divine right of kings and had no use for Parliament in his mind. He's like, no, I believe in the divine right of kings. And so at this time, Parliament was not a regular fixture. I don't know the specific ways it's all phrased in the Constitution, but at this time, Parliament only convenes when the king calls it. So Parliament is like an advisory council. You still have, if you know today, you had the House of Commons, you had the House of Lords, and so you had your representatives who were elected or chosen for their, the landowners, X, Y, and Z, amount of money and representative. And so you've got the House of Commons, you've got the House of Lords, and they come together, and they serve an advisory function and a mediating government. Like, if the king is going to do anything, he needs all of these people to be on board. Like, if he's going to raise an army, if he's going to raise money, the king needs Parliament. King Charles says, I don't need Parliament. And so for 11 years, he never convenes Parliament. This is variously known as the 11 years of King Charles' personal rule, or more negatively, the 11 years of King Charles' tyranny. We're not having Parliament. He did everything possible to avoid calling Parliament so that he could just rule and do whatever he wanted. And he was very, very unpopular. And King Charles, so he hated Parliament, and he did not like Calvinism. At this time, it wasn't from King Charles, but there was a growing sort of high church Arminian movement within the English church. So you had a high church. What do I mean by high church? When you hear high church, what do you think? Sacramentalism, ceremonialism. So you had the high church Arminians, besides things like vestments, and kneeling for communion, 100%. They're like, okay, let's get rid of the communion table, and let's build an actual stone altar. So we get rid of the communion table, we build an actual stone altar, and we want to put that at the east, because that's where the sun rises, and traditionally you had the communion altar in the east. And so doing things like that, the wider public is like, that's going back to Roman Catholicism. We are suspicious of this. Even if you say you're not holding to transubstantiation and things like that, this is suspicious. And so you had a high and a rejection of Calvinism. So you had this high church Arminian movement within Anglicanism. And King Charles was all about that. He liked the high church Arminians, and so he was fairly anti-Calvinist, and he tried to stamp out Calvinist teaching and preaching. He appointed an Arminian Archbishop of Canterbury, and then over time, they're putting high church Arminians in various positions. There was a joke or a saying at the time. It says, what do the Arminians have? Answer, all the best bishoprics. They've got them all. They're in control, and Charles is trying to stamp out Reformed preaching, which does not go over well, because you have to remember, at the time, preaching is popular, even among people who are not necessarily saved or convictional. It was a form of, in one sense, entertainment, different than maybe how we think of it today, but people go, you want to hear a good preacher. And so even if you yourself as a layperson didn't quite understand the theological debates, like, I don't know what's going on between the Arminians and Calvinists, like, it's above my pay grade, I don't get it. You could say, like, well, this guy's a good preacher, though. He's a good preacher, and the king is silencing him. Now the king is like saying all these good preachers can't preach. And so Charles was unpopular, even by people who wouldn't theologically have been able to tell you what the argument was about. Charles was unpopular. He was silencing preachers. He was doing all these reforms that to the popular mind looked like, are we going back to Catholicism? People did not like him. So Charles, he's engaging in this personal rule. That's from 1629 to 1640. And you had, this all leads eventually to a civil war, the English Civil War. So what happens in the English Civil War is, I am summarizing. This is a crazy time period. There was a roller coaster. There was lots of ups and downs. But some really important, really good things came out of this, even though it's a hard time period. So what happens in the English Civil War? Charles, he's not a popular guy already. And then, we're not even talking about it, but up in Scotland, Scotland becomes like Presbyterian. It's full-on Presbyterian under the influence like John Knox, again, coming out of Geneva. And there's fighting there, but Scotland, we're summarizing, becomes full-on Presbyterian. So they're Presbyterian, but they're under Charles I. And then Scotland rebels. Scotland rebels against Charles I. And now Charles I is in a pickle because he cannot deal with this. He cannot deal with the problem, or if they officially rebelled, or if they're just afraid of Scotland rebelling at this particular time period, I can't quite sure. But Charles is worried about Scotland, and so he has to summon a parliament. Like, he can't respond to this without the widespread support that he would get from Parliament. So he summons Parliament, and Parliament is not interested at all in talking about Scotland. They just don't like Charles, so they're just talking about how bad Charles is and how they want to fix things with Charles. And so Charles cancels Parliament. It's called the Short Parliament. It didn't last long. Like, he got them together, and he's like, this is too rebellious. Like, no, we cancel this. But nope, they've got problems from Scotland, and also, we get the time period mixing, but eventually they got problems from Ireland, which is Catholic. So you've got the Catholic Irish under Protestant king, and they're afraid that the Protestants are going to come in and wipe them out, so they strike first. And so there's a Catholic rebellion, and conservative estimates is they kill 12,000 Irish Protestants. And so now, over on the mainland England, we're afraid of the Irish Catholics coming to attack us. And so it's a tumultuous time period, and Charles just cannot get away from needing a parliament. So finally, he does summon Parliament, and it's called the Long Parliament, and they meet. But again, they're not interested in dealing with the Scottish. In fact, many of those in Parliament were friendly to the Scottish. They were themselves Puritans. They were positive towards Presbyterianism. And so what Parliament does is it just strips, guts Charles of power. It's just a condemnation of Charles. They pass all sorts of new laws and acts, including, I forget what it's called, but the Triennial Parliament. So from now on, Parliament is going to meet at least every 3 years, not whenever the king summons it. Not going 11 years without Parliament again. Not, all sorts of things. And you have to understand, they did not want to abolish the monarchy and their constitution that they had at the time. They did not want to be anarchists, and they had both theological and governmental reasons that they believed in the king. And so Charles is the rightful king. So they didn't want to get rid of him. So they needed him. So they're making all these demands and reforms and passing laws. And Charles is just going, no. Like, that's how Charles responded. Like, no. So I'm not going to budge. They're not going to budge. And we kind of have this stalemate. And they're passing all these laws and things to mitigate Charles's power, lower his influence. And then you've got the Irish problem. And it's because of that Parliament realizes, okay, we do need to raise an army. However, we're afraid of the Irish Catholics. So we do need to raise an army. We do not trust Charles with an army. Like, traditionally, the king is in charge of an army. And Parliament says, we don't trust Charles with an army. So what Parliament does is, like, we're going to raise an army, but Parliament is going to be in control of the army. And that's, like, unheard of. Like, now Parliament looks like they're going against tradition and the law, and they're anarchists. And then Charles raises his own little small band of people, 400, and he marches into Parliament to try to arrest 5 leaders that he views as rebellious, but they got wind of that, so they had gotten away. And that makes Charles super unpopular. He barges into Parliament with 400 armed goons, and so then Charles has to leave London. So Charles leaves London, and this thus begins the English Civil War. And so in the midst of all of this, at first Parliament is unified. We don't like Charles. That's what Parliament is unified around. Then as Charles kind of becomes more in the background and they're starting to be able to discuss other things, then Parliament divides along the religious lines. You've got the Puritans in Parliament who want reform to the church. And then you've got, who eventually become called the Royalists, who, no, or the conservative Anglicans, like, no, we want Anglicanism as it is, or as it was. That's what we believe is right. We don't want to jettison Book of Common Prayer. We don't want these new things. We want to be conservative Anglicans, for what that meant at the time. So you've got the Puritans and the conservative Anglicans, who eventually become called the Royalists, start fighting, which is interesting, because all of the Parliament, remember, didn't like Charles. But on the conservative Anglican side, they realized if we side with Charles, that's how we'll get what we want religiously. So they become known as Royalists, and they side with Charles. And then they kind of split. And so you've got the Parliament in London, which basically remains Puritan, and the Royalists leave, and they go start their own Parliament in Oxford. And so you've got competing parliaments now. And then you've got the King, who he's got his own thing going on. And then you've got the Scottish, and they're attacking, and you're worried about the Irish attacking. And so you've got a war that actually breaks out. Actual battles start. And so you've got a war going on between these groups. There's actually a third group. So first you had the Royalists, so King Charles, and then the Parliament that eventually sides with him for religious reasons, the Royalists. And then you've got the Puritans in Parliament. So you had Parliament, the Royalists. And Parliament raises an army. And they're in control of the army. And eventually the army goes, I'm not with either of you. So what happens is you've got this army raised, and Parliament wants to enforce Presbyterianism. The Royalists want to enforce Old Anglicanism. The army is mostly composed of independents, separatists, Baptists, so on and so forth, and they're like, we don't actually want either of these things. And then Parliament tries to disband the army and doesn't give them their back pay, and they're like, no, we're not disbanding. We're going to do our own thing. So now you've got 3 forces. You've got Parliament, which has mostly the Presbyterians. You've got the army, which has just a wide mix, and you've got the Royalists, the Old Anglicans, who are with King Charles. And they're all fighting. But in the midst of this, jumping out of the political turmoil, in the midst of this, before the war actually started, and before Parliament had split, they were able to agree, let's have a religious conference. Let's bring together people to reform the church. And so they bring together, this happens, so they decide this before the war starts. The war starts, but then this still goes on. They are able to have the Westminster Assembly, a gathering of theological brilliance. Richard Baxter, who wasn't there, but a brilliant guy. Richard Baxter looked at the list of names at the Westminster Assembly, and he said, there has probably never been a better group of people gathered together since the 12 apostles. He's like, this is it, man. And so the Westminster Assembly produces a number of documents, the Westminster Larger, Shorter Catechism, Presbyterian Book of Government. So a wide gathering of people, but the Westminster Assembly produces the Westminster Confession of Faith, which interestingly, it's produced by the English to be the new confession of the English Church, which is ironic because Westminster Confession is not the confession of the English Church and never has been. It gets adopted by the Scottish Presbyterians and a number of other groups, but it never gets adopted by the English because eventually the Civil War breaks out. All sorts of crazy things happen. Remember, Charles, the Royalists side with him because they want Anglicanism, and so we don't like Charles, but we're going to side with him because we want old school Anglicanism. But then Charles goes to the Scottish Presbyterians, and he's like, I promise I'll make it all Presbyterian if you side with me. So then Charles is now on the side of the Scottish Presbyterians, and so he comes in with them, and it's like he's just promising to every side anything that it sounds like they'll want. The army eventually says, we're killing Charles. So that you've got the army, which is originally Parliament's army, and then they've gone rogue. They capture Charles, they kill Charles. They establish for a little bit of time in England a republic. It's the only time England was a republic. I don't remember how long it lasted, 10 years. Eventually, Charles' son, Charles II, is restored to the throne, Return of the King in 1660. And that's, at that point, all the Puritans basically get kicked out or finally do leave the English church. And so you've got them now all being separatists, either being Congregationalists, Presbyterians, or Baptists. But in all this, you've got the production of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which gets adopted by various groups. So the Scottish Presbyterians, a number of other Presbyterians, but then even the Congregationalists. The Congregationalists adopt. So you could be a Congregationalist and not a Baptist. So Congregationalist refers to your view of church government. And so you had Congregationalists who held to infant baptism, and they adopted the Westminster Confession, but they modified it to account for their Congregationalism. That was called the Savoy Declaration. You had the Reformed Baptists. They adopted the Westminster Confession, modified it to account for their Baptist differences, that we know as the London Baptist Confession. It was actually adopted in 1671, 77, but we generally know it as the 1689 Confession because that's when 107 Baptist ministers got together and actually wrote their name on it, and we say we're adopting this officially. So, but the Savoy Declaration, the 1689 London Baptist Confession are basically the Westminster Confession with some revision, and they were very consciously adopted by those groups to show our uniformity with the wider Reformed world. It's not that they were lazy and man, we can't write our own confession. Let's just copy the Westminster Confession. It looks so good. No, it wasn't a laziness. It was a conscious, we want to show our unity. Yeah, we have some differences, but we want to show our unity with the wide Reformed world. And so the Congregationalists and the Baptists both adopt the Westminster Confession with their various revisions necessary for their particular groups. And as I said, the English Civil War, lots of ups and downs, twists and turns. Eventually the monarchy is restored, and at that point the Puritans basically all leave. And so now at this point it no longer makes sense to call, now Puritans and Separatists start to align. Because at the time Separatists were the people leaving the English church, Puritans were the ones staying for Reform, but now they're all out. Now that's when Anglicanism kind of settles into more of what we know today, which is more high church. For most Anglican churches, if you've ever been to, like I said, I've been to an Anglican church, did the whole kneeling for communion thing. You have a more high church, more, depending on, again, the congregation, more friendliness towards Arminianism. So you have high church Arminian Anglicanism. You still have Reformed Anglicanism, but all of it tends to be more high church. That kind of settles into place after the English Civil War and after Charles II returns to power. And so then the hardcore Puritans, the ones who want full reform, they want to leave the ceremonialism of the medieval world, they're all out of the English church, and they're either Presbyterians, they're Congregationalists, or they're Baptists. All right, a lot for today. Any questions, final comments? Let's pray. Lord, we do thank you again just for your faithfulness through all of time. We thank you for your faithfulness to your church in times when it seems like just what's going on in the outside world would make it not possible for your church to survive. War, rumors of war, famine, disease, all of these things happen, and you preserve your people. And so we thank you. We thank you that you're able to preserve your people through political turmoil, through the shaking of the world. We thank you that your people endure, and that even as you shake the world, you do this always, ever, to purify, refine, and to protect and preserve your church. So help us to grow in our confidence in these things and in our confidence in you and your ability to preserve your people, especially as we face challenges today, theological challenges, political challenges, all things that to our eyes look like it's going to be the end of the church. Help us to remember that you are ever always in control, and all of this is ultimately serving your purpose to both build and preserve your church. Grant us this faith, we pray, in Jesus' name and